When you think of the 70s, what comes to mind? Probably disco, bell-bottoms, and a new sense of freedom. It was a time of cultural revolution, vibrant music, and iconic fashion we still look back on with a bit of nostalgia. But just beneath that glittering surface, a much darker current was flowing. It was a decade of shocking crimes that tore through society, leaving scars that we can still feel today. This was a time when the optimism of the 60s soured into something more cynical and fearful. The peace and love movement gave way to widespread unrest, and a feeling of vulnerability started to creep into the American mindset. Suddenly, the monsters weren't just in the movies. They were living next door, performing at kids' parties, and taunting the police on the front pages of newspapers. These weren't just crimes. They were cultural bombshells that changed how people saw the world, how much they trusted their neighbors, and how law enforcement had to operate. From brazen kidnappings that played out on live TV to serial killers who became household names, these stories exposed the dark underbelly of a decade and forced changes that still matter today. The 1970s? For many, it was the decade of disco and bell-bottoms. But beneath the glittering surface, a darker current was flowing. It was a time of shocking crimes that ripped through the fabric of society, leaving scars that are still felt today, from brazen kidnappings to serial killers who became household names. We're looking at 7 crimes from the 70s that still have the power to shock us. First up is a case so horrifying that, when it was discovered, it was called the worst example of serial murder in American history. This is the story of the Houston mass murders, and the man at the center of it all, Dean Corll, who got the sickeningly sweet nickname, the Candyman. Between 1970 and 1973, something deeply disturbing was happening in the Houston Heights neighborhood. Teenage boys and young men just started disappearing. Back then, without 24-hour news or interconnected databases, police often dismissed these cases as typical runaways. Houston Heights was a lower-income area, so it was easy for law enforcement to just assume these were troubled kids leaving home. But the truth was far more sinister. The boys weren't running away, they were being systematically hunted. Dean Corll was an electrician whose family had once owned a local candy company. That's how he got his nickname. He was known for giving free sweets to neighborhood kids. This seemingly harmless reputation gave him the perfect cover. But Corll wasn't working alone. He recruited 2 teenage accomplices, Elmer Henley and David Brooks, to help him lure victims. Henley and Brooks were friends with many of the boys who vanished, and they used that trust, promising parties or drugs, to get them back to one of Corll's houses. Henley later said Corll paid them $200 for each boy they brought him. Once inside, the friendly act disappeared. The victims were restrained and subjected to unimaginable torture before being murdered. For 3 years, this reign of terror went completely unnoticed by the authorities. Dozens of families were left wondering what happened to their sons, never dreaming they had fallen prey to a predator living right there in their community. The whole horrific enterprise came crashing down on August 8, 1973. That night, Henley was at Corll's house with a young woman and another boy. When Corll ordered Henley to assault the woman, after years of going along with it, Henley finally refused. A fight broke out, and the 17-year-old accomplice, Elmer Henley, shot and killed Dean Corll. When police arrived, Henley didn't just confess to one murder. He unraveled a story of a killing spree that stunned even the most hardened investigators. Henley and Brooks led police to the gruesome burial sites. 18 bodies were unearthed from a rented boat shed. More were found buried in the woods and on a remote beach. The final count was staggering, at least 28 victims, though some think the real number is even higher. The victims, who became known as the Lost Boys, were between 13 and 20 years old. The case sent a shockwave across the nation: the sheer brutality, the young age of the victims, and the accomplices. And the complete failure of the police to connect the dots was a terrifying wake-up call. The Houston mass murders shattered the illusion that it could happen here and forced a national reckoning with how missing children, especially those dismissed as runaways, were treated. Next up is a story that completely blurred the lines between victim and criminal. a saga of terror and political extremism that captivated and confused the entire nation. The Kidnapping of Patty Hearst. On the night of February 4, 1974, 19-year-old Patty Hearst, granddaughter of the powerful newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, was abducted from her Berkeley apartment. Her was beaten as she was dragged away by a militant group called the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA. The SLA was a small, violent, radical group that had already murdered an Oakland school superintendent by kidnapping an heiress from one of America's most famous families. They guaranteed they'd get the one thing they wanted most: a massive public platform. The kidnapping was instantly front-page news. The SLA started sending audio tapes to the media, at first demanding the release of 2 imprisoned members. When that didn't work, they made a new bizarre demand that the Hearst family give $70 worth of food to every needy person in California, an operation that would have cost around $400 million. Desperate, Patty's father financed a $2 million food distribution program. But the event was a chaotic mess and didn't lead to his daughter's release. For the next 2 months, Patty was held captive. She later testified she was kept blindfolded in a closet, abused, and indoctrinated with the group's ideology. Then, on April 3, 1974, everything changed. A new tape was released. On it, Patty Hearst announced she had joined the SLA, called her family the corporate enemy, and declared she had a new name, Tanya. Was it real, or was she a terrified victim of what we now call Stockholm Syndrome? The nation didn't have to wait long for an answer. Just 12 days later, on April 15th, surveillance cameras at a San Francisco bank captured a shocking scene. There was Patty Hearst holding a carbine rifle, actively helping her former captors rob the bank. That image of the kidnapped heiress turned urban guerrilla was burned into the national consciousness. She was no longer just a victim. She was a wanted fugitive. The FBI launched a massive manhunt. The saga took another wild turn in May 1974. When a huge shootout between the LAPD and SLA members was broadcast live on TV, 6 SLA members died in a fiery standoff, but Hearst wasn't there. She stayed on the run for over a year, participating in other crimes, including another bank robbery where a woman was killed. Finally, on September 18, 1975, the FBI caught her. Her trial was one of the biggest of the decade. The prosecution argued she was a willing revolutionary. Her defense, led by the famous lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, claimed she was a brainwashed victim of trauma. The jury didn't buy it. Patty Hearst was found guilty of bank robbery and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Her sentence was later commuted by President Jimmy Carter, and she was eventually pardoned by President Bill Clinton. The Patty Hearst case is still a shocking and complex cultural touchstone, uniquely 70s collision of wealth, extremism, and media spectacle. There are few phrases more chilling than the killer clown. But in the 1970s, this wasn't a horror movie plot. It was the horrifying reality of John Wayne Gacy, a man who destroyed the image of the friendly neighbor and became one of America's most prolific serial killers. If you lived in his suburban Chicago community, you'd think John Wayne Gacy was a model citizen. He was a successful contractor, active in local politics, and a friendly guy who was well-liked. He even volunteered to entertain kids at charity events and parties, dressed as Pogo the Clown, and was once photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter. But this respectable image was a mask for a monster. Behind the closed doors of his house on Somerdale Avenue, Gacy was a sadistic predator and murderer. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy lured at least 33 young men and boys to his home. Many of his victims were teens who worked for him or were vulnerable kids he met in the area. His method was chillingly consistent. He'd trick them into being handcuffed, often saying he was showing them a magic trick. Once they were helpless, he would assault and torture them before strangling them to death. For years, a horrible smell came from the house, which Gacy blamed on moisture in the crawl space. The truth was that the smell was death. Gacy had buried 26 of his victims in the cramped crawl space under his home, sometimes stacking bodies on top of each other. When it was full, he buried 3 more elsewhere on his property and threw 4 others into the Des Plaines River. His murder spree finally came apart in December 1978. Police were investigating the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest, who was last seen talking to Gacy about a job. The investigation led them to Gacy's home. During their initial searches, they found items that linked him not only to Piest, but to other missing young men. On December 21, 1978, armed with a search warrant, police began excavating the property. What they found was a mass grave. One by one, the bodies of Gacy's victims were pulled from the crawl space. When the news broke, it sent a wave of absolute horror across the country. The man who dressed as a clown to make children happy was a monster who had murdered dozens. The case was a brutal lesson in the nature of evil. It wasn't some shadowy figure in an alley. It was a man who lived right among his victims. The Gacy case hammered home the idea of stranger danger, but with a terrifying twist. The danger isn't always a stranger. John Wayne Gacy was convicted of 33 murders and executed in 1994. But the legacy of the killer clown is a shocking reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we never suspect. For 13 terrifying months, from the summer of 1976 to the summer of 1977, New York City was held hostage by fear. A phantom gunman was stalking the streets, targeting young couples in parked cars, seemingly at random. He became known by the weapon he used, the .44 caliber killer, and later by the name he gave himself. The Son of Sam. The attacks began on July 29, 1976, in the Bronx. Two young women were sitting in their car when a man walked up, pulled out a .44 caliber revolver, and fired, killing one and wounding the other. Over the next year, the shooter struck again and again across the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. His targets were almost always young people, often women with long, dark hair, sitting in a quiet, parked car. The randomness of the attacks created a citywide paranoia. No one knew where he would strike next. The city's legendary nightlife ground to a halt. Women with dark hair cut it or dyed it blonde. Couples stopped going to secluded lovers' lanes. The feeling of safety in one of the world's greatest cities just evaporated. What made this case so uniquely shocking was that the killer started talking. In April 1977, after murdering a young couple, he left his first note at the scene, calling himself the Son of Sam. He then sent a bizarre, taunting letter to New York Daily News columnist Jimmy Breslin. The letters were rambling and creepy, turning the manhunt into a public spectacle. The killer wasn't just committing murder, he was creating a terrifying public brand. The NYPD launched the largest manhunt in the city's history, but it was a mess. Eyewitness descriptions were all over the place, leading to inaccurate police sketches. The killer left few clues, and the random nature of the attacks made it impossible to predict his next move. The break in the case didn't come from a brilliant detective, but from a simple parking ticket. On July 31, 1977, the killer carried out his final attack. A witness near the scene remembered seeing a cop ticketing an illegally parked car around the time of the shooting. Investigators checked every ticket issued in the area that night. One belonged to a Ford Galaxy registered to a 24-year-old postal worker from Yonkers named David Berkowitz. On August 10, 1977, police found Berkowitz in his car. He reportedly smiled and said, "Well, you got me." Inside the car, they found the .44 caliber revolver. Berkowitz confessed to all the shootings, claiming he was obeying a demon that spoke to him through his neighbor's dog. He was found competent for trial and pleaded guilty to 6 murders. The Son of Sam case left a permanent mark, leading to new laws to prevent criminals from profiting from their notoriety. It showed how one person could paralyze a city with fear, and how the media could become an unwilling partner in their campaign of terror. Some criminals are famous for their brutality, others for their cunning, but very few have ever combined charm and pure evil the way Ted Bundy did. To the world, he was handsome, smart, and charismatic. But behind that disarming smile was one of the most monstrous serial killers of the 20th century, a man whose crimes in the mid-70s would forever change how we picture a killer. Bundy's terror campaign really kicked off in 1974. Young, attractive college women started vanishing across Washington and Oregon. The cases were baffling. The only connection seemed to be their appearance. Witnesses reported seeing a handsome young man, sometimes with his arm in a sling or on crutches, asking for help near his Volkswagen Beetle. He played on his victims' compassion to lure them in before overpowering them. In the fall of 1974, Bundy moved to Utah for law school, and the disappearances followed him. Women began vanishing in Utah, then Colorado, and Idaho. He was a ghost, moving from state to state, leaving a trail of death. His methods were horrific. He would kidnap, assault, and murder his victims, often bludgeoning them to death. He later confessed to returning to the remote locations where he dumped their bodies to perform necrophilic acts. The first crack in his mask appeared in August 1975 when a cop pulled him over in Utah. A search of his car turned up a ski mask, a crowbar, rope, and handcuffs, a serial killer's toolkit. He was arrested, and while police didn't know the full extent of his crimes yet, they started linking him to a growing list of murders. In 1976, he was convicted of kidnapping Carol Durange, one of the few women who managed to escape him. But Bundy's story gets even crazier. While in custody, he became a suspect in a Colorado murder. In June 1977, during a hearing where he was acting as his own lawyer, he was left unshackled in the courthouse library. He simply walked to a window, jumped out of the second story, and vanished. He was on the run for 6 days before being recaptured, but he wasn't done. On December 30th, 1977, he pulled off a second, more elaborate escape from jail and made his way to Florida. It was there that he unleashed his final, horrifying rampage. On January 14th, 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University, brutally attacking 4 women and killing 2. The savagery shocked even seasoned investigators. 3 weeks later, he abducted and murdered his youngest victim, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Bundy was finally caught for good in February 1978. His trial for the Florida murders was a national media sensation. One of the first ever televised. America was captivated and horrified by the man on their screens. He was charming and articulate, yet accused of the most heinous crimes. Bundy shattered the stereotype of the creepy loner killer. He proved that evil could wear a handsome, educated, and completely normal-looking mask. Before his execution in 1989, he confessed to 30 murders, but experts believe the true number is much higher. For the public, it was a terrifying lesson that evil doesn't always advertise itself. For our last case, we're heading to the end of the decade and into the early 80s. It's a story of a city gripped by fear, a community torn apart by tragedy, and a series of crimes that exposed deep racial tensions and raised painful questions that for some are still unanswered. This is the story of the Atlanta child murders. Between 1979 and 1981, a shadow fell over Atlanta as a string of at least 29 murders, mostly of African American children and adolescents, took place. The spree began in the summer of 1979 with the discovery of 2 murdered boys. Over the next 22 months, the count of missing and murdered youth kept climbing, sending a wave of panic and grief through Atlanta's black community. The city was on edge. Parents were terrified to let their kids play outside. Curfews were put in place. The community even organized its own patrols to watch over their neighborhoods. The case quickly drew national attention, but with that came immense frustration. Many in the black community felt the investigation was slow and inadequate, believing that, if the victims had been white, the response would have been far more urgent. This fueled a climate of distrust, not just toward the killer, but toward the authorities. The FBI was eventually brought in, and a special task force was created. They were desperate for a break. They had one clue: a specific type of rare yellow-green carpet fiber had been found on a number of the victims. As the investigation ramped up, the killer changed tactics and began dumping bodies in the Chattahoochee River. This led police to stake out the city's bridges. On the night of May 22, 1981, officers watching a bridge heard a loud splash in the water below. Moments later, they stopped the first car to drive off the bridge. The driver was a 23-year-old freelance photographer named Wayne Williams. Though they let him go, he was now their main suspect. 2 days later, a body was pulled from the river downstream. Investigators started building their case. They found that the rare carpet fibers from the victims matched the carpeting in Williams's home. Hairs found on some victims were consistent with hairs from Williams and his dog. In February 1982, a jury convicted Wayne Williams of the murders of 2 of the adult victims. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. After the conviction, law enforcement announced they believed Williams was responsible for at least 22 of the other deaths, and they closed those cases. The killings stopped after Williams's arrest. But for many, especially the families of the children, the verdict didn't bring closure. Doubts lingered. Was one man really responsible for all of those deaths? The debate has continued for decades. In 2019, the city of Atlanta officially reopened the investigation. hoping modern DNA technology could finally provide definitive answers. The Atlanta child murders remain a painful scar on the city's history, a shocking case that not only stole the lives of dozens of young people, but also exposed the deep and painful fault lines of race and justice in America. From the calculated deception of Ted Bundy to the random terror of the Son of Sam, the crimes of the 1970s revealed new and terrifying faces of evil. They exposed critical flaws in our society, from the way we reported the news to the way we searched for the missing. Cases like the Houston mass murders and the Atlanta child murders forced a long-overdue focus on victims from marginalized communities, showing how easily the vulnerable could slip through the cracks. These events did more than just shock the public. They forced a total rethinking of law enforcement, spurred new investigative tech, and forever changed our cultural understanding of safety. They're stories from a bygone decade, but their echoes still resonate today. A chilling reminder of a time when the darkness lurking just beneath the surface was laid bare for all to see. What do you think? Are there other cases from the 70s that you find particularly shocking? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video compelling, please give it a like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most impactful crimes.